Hello there. In this video, I'd like to introduce two of the key terms in the first period of Foucault's writing up to roughly the mid-70s, usually called his archaeological period. One of the terms is archaeology, and the other one is episteme. And I think with these two terms, we'll really be able to get a sense of what Foucault is doing in this first period of his writing. So let's start with archaeology. It's the name he uses to describe the way he does history. And there are certain key elements of it that we can draw out. The first one is that he doesn't start with universal ideas, but with concrete practices. And this is really anti-Hegelian. Remember, Hegel's got this idea of spirit coming to self-realization. It's a big 30,000-foot idea that shapes the whole of history and how he reads every individual thing that happens. Foucault doesn't do that. Foucault tries to start with particular behaviors and particular practices, and he looks carefully at how they work, and he tries to extrapolate an understanding of history from those concrete behaviors. Secondly, Foucault does not focus on human intentions, but instead he focuses on rules and assumptions that operate below the level of consciousness. He calls this the unthought of an epoch in his book, The Order of Things. There are certain accepted ways of thinking and behaving in a particular period in history that make some things thinkable and some things unthinkable. This is his notion of the episteme that we're going to look at in a moment. And the thing that I want you to realize about it now is that it means that Foucault isn't really primarily interested in what people said. So, for example, it's not Martin Luther King's I have a dream, and let's look at that speech, let's look at what he said. Foucault is interested in what it is possible to say in any particular epoch, what the concepts that we've got and what the assumptions that we have allow us to think, and what is simply unthinkable because we don't have the concepts or the assumptions to make it make any sense. So it's not about what is said in a particular period, but what it's possible to say and what it's impossible to say. Now, this idea of what it's possible to say brings us to the notion of episteme. Let me read you a little explanation from Foucault's The Order of Things. What I'm attempting to bring to light, he says, is the epistemological field, the episteme, in which knowledge, envisaged apart from all criteria having reference to its rational value or to its objective forms, grounds its positivity, and thereby manifests a history which is not that of its growing perfection, but rather that of its conditions of possibility. Such an enterprise is not so much a history in the traditional meaning of the word, as an archaeology. Let me give you an example to try and make that quotation a little easier to understand. Imagine a court of law. There are ways and procedures for establishing what counts as truth in a court of law. There are certain things that are admissible as evidence. There are certain things that are not admissible as evidence. And it's by following these rules that you produce truth at the end of the process. And it's if everyone follows these rules well that you'll come out with the truth of the case. So what you've got is a series of rules and procedures and behaviours and roles that produce, at the end of the day, what we call truth. And Foucault sees truth more broadly in that sense. Look again at this quotation. Epistemes ground the positivity of truth. In other words, they set the rules for what will count as being true, what will count as being knowledge in a particular moment in history, in the same way that the legal system sets rules for how you establish truth in a court of law. And to continue our law analogy then, it's these rules that Foucault is interested in, not the particular truth that pops out the other end, but the rules that were used to produce it. And those rules, this collection of those rules, are called epistemes at a particular historical moment. Now, let me try and explain what epistemes are and what they're not through a series of diagrams. First of all, an episteme is not a particular historical and cultural way of referring to an overarching and essentially unchanging concept outside culture and time. So imagine that there's a timeless, eternal thing called, for example, madness. And at different times, this one unchanging thing is referred to using different names. So the medieval world will have one name for it, the Renaissance will have another name, the classical period will have a third name, and the modern period will have a fourth name, but they're all referring to this one unchanging thing. That is not how an episteme works. The rules for producing truth don't always give you the same unchanging concepts and categories with different names in a particular epoch. Nor is it really the case that there's a succession of equivalent concepts, each historically and culturally bound. So we've got rid of this eternal overarching idea, and now there's the medieval age calling madness one thing, and the Renaissance age calling madness another thing, and so forth. But it's still really madness. We can still read over one-to-one the correspondence between these concepts in the different ages. You can't really do that either. That's not a good understanding of what an episteme is. It's more like this. The concepts in an episteme, like madness, for example, or like any other concept, can only be understood in relation to the other concepts in that episteme. Think of it as a grid or a net of all the different concepts that are available to a particular historical period. They're related to each other in different ways. So in the medieval period, the idea of madness might occupy a different place in the web of concepts. It might gather together more behaviours than the notion of unreason in the Renaissance, in the classical period, for example. So it's not that there are different names for the same thing, it's that different behaviours, different ideas are gathered together differently at different periods in history. And so we can't think that we can simply read over in terms of a one-to-one correspondence between something that happens in the Renaissance period and something that happens in the classical period. We've got to look at the whole structure of the episteme and understand how things hang together, how things relate to each other. Foucault, in The Order of Things, particularly focuses on three epistemes, and he isolates particular characteristics, particular rules for the production of truth and knowledge in each of them. The first one's the Renaissance episteme, and here knowledge is produced by a series of similitudes or affinities or correspondences, and he gives a lovely example of the plant aconite, which has little white seeds with a black dot on them. And for the Renaissance period, that looked like the human eye. And that was no coincidence in the Renaissance. There was an affinity between aconite and the eye, and so it was used for treating eye diseases. And the whole world was viewed as a series of correspondences and affinities between different and disparate things. That was the way that knowledge was built in the Renaissance. If we come to the classical episteme, it's no longer a question of building knowledge through through laws of correspondence, but now it's representation that's key, how we represent knowledge to ourselves. It's all about taxonomy, making lists, making categories, and mathematical calculation. If you think about Descartes' coordinates, Cartesian coordinates, mapping out the dimensions of space, that's the way that the classical episteme tries to generate knowledge. Come through to the modern episteme, starting with Immanuel Kant, and there's a growing understanding that classical representation misses out one important thing. It misses out the fact that we, the representers, have our own minds whirring around, and that actually we could perhaps be producing the things that we think are out there in the world. And Kant famously says in his first critique that space and time are not really out there in the world. They're effects of our minds. They're categories of our understanding. And so in the modern episteme, you start to pull back from a confident understanding of how to produce knowledge in the world and think, hey, hang on, what if there's stuff going on in our minds that's making us appear to have all this knowledge? Whereas in fact, we need to start questioning ourselves, the ones doing the representing. Therefore, the final point, the locus of representation, man, humanity, is questioned. The world cannot be perfectly represented. And these are the main epistemes that Foucault discusses in this archaeological period.